Blood is notoriously difficult to wash out of worn denim. This is not the kind of thing they teach you in school. It is not printed in any textbook or whispered between friends at lunch. It is the kind of brutal, ugly knowledge that only arrives in the small hours of the morning, when the world has gone quiet and the only sound left is the frantic hammering of your own terrified heart. Mara Gallagher learned this truth at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a suffocating August night in the Nevada desert. She was 16 years old. She was not a hero. She was not brave. She was just a girl caught between two worlds, running barefoot through the dark, wearing a dead man's vest with three killers closing the distance behind her. But we will get to the blood. We will get to the knife and the boy who stepped in front of it. First, you need to understand the girl, because without her, none of this happens. Without Mara Gallagher, the town of Oak Haven sleeps through the night. The Sinclair gas station sells its usual nothing to nobody, and a 17-year-old kid named Ethan Cole finishes his algebra homework, clocks out at dawn, and never learns what his own courage tastes like. It tastes like copper, but that comes later. 12 hours before the blood, the Nevada sun sat heavy and mean over the town of Oak Haven. It was a small place, the kind of town that mapmakers sometimes forgot to include, and tourists only discovered when their GPS led them astray. A forgotten knot of dust-colored buildings strung along Route 9 like beads on a fraying thread. The primary exports were heat, silence, and broken promises. The desert pressed in from every direction, vast and indifferent, reminding the 600 residents each day that they were simply borrowing this land from something ancient and uncaring. Mara sat in the passenger seat of a silver Chevy Tahoe, her bare feet propped on the dashboard, watching the desert scroll past the window like a film reel stuck on the same desolate frame. The air conditioning was blasting, but the August heat was relentless, pressing against the glass like a living thing trying to get inside. Behind the wheel was her uncle Roy Gallagher. Roy was her father's younger brother, a tall, lean man in his late 40s with sun-weathered skin and a quiet, easy smile that made him look like a high school history teacher, rather than the road captain of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs west of the Mississippi. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, his leather cut folded neatly on the back seat. Out of respect for Mara, Roy never wore the colors when he drove her. He knew she was still figuring out how she felt about the wolf on the back. They were returning from her summer visit. Every year, Mara's father, Silas Gallagher, the man the world knew as Iron Silas, sent her to spend 6 weeks at her aunt's house in Flagstaff, away from the clubhouse, away from the rumble of engines and the smell of gun oil and the late-night conversations that stopped the moment she walked into a room. Silas wanted something different for his daughter. He had told her that once years ago in a rare moment of softness. He had knelt down in front of her, his massive scarred hands holding her small ones, and said, "The road I ride is mine, baby girl. It is not yours. You're going to have choices I never had." Mara loved her father with a fierce, complicated ache that she could never fully explain to anyone who did not grow up the way she did. She loved the way he laughed deep and rare and real. She loved the way he checked her homework on the nights he was home, his enormous fingers turning the pages of her history textbook with surprising gentleness. She loved the way he called her baby girl, even though she was 16 and taller than most of the boys in her class. But she also feared what he was, not him, never him, but the world that orbited around him like dark satellites. The enforcers who sat in the living room cleaning weapons while she ate cereal in the kitchen. The phone calls at 3 in the morning that made him dress in silence and disappear for days. The news stories she sometimes saw on television, stories about raids and arrests, and bodies found in the desert, stories that never mentioned her father's name, but somehow always seemed to circle the same territory. She lived between two worlds, and she fit perfectly in neither. "You are quiet," Roy said, glancing at her as he navigated a long sweeping curve in the highway. The desert stretched out before them, painted in shades of rust and gold by the dying afternoon sun. Mara shrugged, just thinking. About school. About everything. Roy nodded slowly, understanding more than she gave him credit for. He reached over and squeezed her shoulder. Once, then returned his hand to the wheel. They drove on in comfortable silence, the miles disappearing beneath the heavy tires. The sun was setting when Mara fell asleep. It was an easy, warm kind of sleep, the kind that comes from long drives and the gentle vibration of highway pavement. Her head rested against the window, her dark hair fanning across the glass. In her dreams, she was back in Flagstaff sitting on her aunt's porch, reading a paperback novel and drinking lemonade. In her dreams, the world was simple. She woke to the sound of Roy swearing. It was a sharp, ugly word that she had never heard him use before. The Tahoe swerved violently, and Mara's seatbelt locked against her chest, snapping her upright. Her eyes flew open. The desert had gone dark while she slept. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the black. And in that tunnel, directly ahead, was a vehicle. A battered matte black Dodge Ram was parked diagonally across the narrow two-lane road, blocking both lanes completely. Its headlights were off. It sat like a dead animal in the dark, waiting. Roy slammed the brakes. The Tahoe skidded, the anti-lock system chattering beneath them, and came to a shuddering stop less than 30 feet from the truck. Dust billowed around them, turning the headlights into two solid beams of swirling gold. "Stay in the car," Roy said. His voice had changed completely. The easy, warm uncle was gone. In his place was a man whose posture had shifted like a switch being thrown. He reached behind his seat with one hand, and Mara heard the unmistakable click of a holster being unsnapped. Before Roy could reach the weapon, the darkness around them erupted. Two figures appeared on Mara's side of the vehicle, materializing from the desert scrub like ghosts. One was enormous, a wall of muscle and bad intentions whose silhouette blotted out the stars. The other was thin, wiry, twitching with a nervous energy that made him look like a starving coyote. The big one was called Bull. The thin one was called Needle. Mara did not know their names yet. She would learn them soon enough. On Roy's side, a third man stepped into the wash of the headlights. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the calm, measured stride of a man who had done this many times before. Vincent Cross. He was not tall, but he was built like a compressed spring. Shaved head, heavy jaw, eyes that reflected the light like two flat stones at the bottom of a dry creek bed. He wore a leather jacket that did not carry any club colors because Vincent Cross did not belong to any brotherhood. He belonged only to himself and to whatever dark calculation was currently running behind those dead, unblinking eyes. Vincent stopped at Roy's window and tapped the glass twice with the heavy brass buckle of his belt. The sound was almost polite, almost casual, as if he were asking a neighbor for a cup of sugar. "Roll it down, Roy," Vincent said, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Let us not make this ugly in front of the kid." Roy did not roll the window down. Instead, he threw the Tahoe into reverse. The engine roared, the heavy vehicle lurching backward. But the reverse lasted less than 2 seconds. A fourth vehicle, a rusted white panel van, had pulled up behind them, cutting off the retreat completely. They were boxed in. "Roy," Mara whispered, her voice small and tight. "Who are these people?" Roy did not answer. He was staring at Vincent through the glass, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, Mara saw something on her uncle's face that she had never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, for her. "Mara," Roy said, his voice low and controlled. "When I tell you to run, you run. Do not stop. Do not look back. Head south toward Route 9. There is a gas station about 2 miles down. A Sinclair station. Get inside. Lock the doors. Call your father." "Uncle Roy, I am not leaving you. You will do exactly as I tell you," Roy said. And for the first time in her life, Mara heard her father's iron authority echoing in her uncle's voice. "These men want you, not me. If you stay in this car, we both die. If you run, I can buy you time." The window shattered inward. Bull had driven his massive fist through the passenger side glass, showering Mara with glittering fragments. She screamed, throwing her arms over her face. Heavy hands reached in, grasping for her fingers like industrial clamps closing around the fabric of her shirt. Roy moved. In one fluid motion, he drew the compact pistol from behind the seat and fired twice through his own door panel. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. On the other side, someone howled in pain. Roy threw open his door, using it as a shield, and stepped out into the night. "Run!" Roy bellowed, his voice carrying across the desert like a cannon shot. "Mara, run now." Mara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely find the seatbelt release. She jabbed at the button, felt the belt snap free, and dove toward the driver's side. Behind her, Bull was reaching through the shattered window, his massive arms sweeping the interior like a bear pawing at a beehive. His fingers caught the heavy leather vest that lay folded on the back seat. Roy's iron hounds cut and pulled it out into the darkness. He did not catch Mara. She hit the ground on the driver's side, her bare feet striking the warm asphalt. The night was a chaos of shouting and gunfire. Roy was grappling with Vincent near the front of the Tahoe. In the strobing muzzle flashes, Mara saw her uncle fighting with a desperate, savage intensity, his fists connecting with heavy, meaty thuds. She wanted to stay. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay, to help, to not abandon the man who had driven her to school plays and taught her how to change a tire and snuck her extra ice cream when her father was not looking. But Roy had given her an order, and Roy had never steered her wrong. Mara ran. She scooped up the leather vest from the gravel where Bull had dropped it, pulling it on over her shoulders as she sprinted. It was instinct, not logic. A piece of her uncle she could carry with her. Armor made of memory and worn leather. She ran south, away from the road, plunging into the open desert. The ground was rough and unforgiving beneath her bare feet. Sharp stones and dry brush tore at her skin. The August night air was still murderously hot, pressing down on her like a wet blanket. She ran without looking back, without stopping, without thinking about anything except the two words Roy had burned into her brain: gas station, Sinclair, Route 9. Behind her, the sounds of the struggle faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Two more gunshots cracked across the flatland, muffled by distance. Then nothing. Mara kept running. Her lungs burned, her feet bled. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat and the dust. She did not know how long she ran. Time loses all meaning when you are 16 years old and running for your life through the dark. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. The desert offered no landmarks, no comfort, nothing except the endless, suffocating black. Then she saw it, a faint, sickly glow on the horizon. Fluorescent light, that particular shade of institutional green that belongs only to gas stations and hospital waiting rooms. It flickered erratically, as if the building it belonged to was not entirely sure it wanted to keep existing. The Sinclair station on Route 9 appeared out of the darkness like a mirage. A single-story concrete block building with a rusted awning over two ancient gas pumps. A dying neon sign buzzed overhead, the S in Sinclair flickering in and out of existence. The parking lot was empty. The highway in both directions was a ribbon of black nothing. Mara crossed the lot at a dead sprint, her bleeding feet slapping against the warm concrete. She hit the glass door with both hands, throwing it open so hard that the bell above it jingled violently, a cheerful mocking sound that had no place in the nightmare she was living. She stumbled into the harsh artificial light and nearly collapsed. Behind the chipped formica counter stood a boy. He was tall for his age, wiry but strong in the way that boys who have done physical labor their whole lives tend to be. He had a smudge of grease on one cheek and a worn algebra textbook open in front of him. His name tag read, Ethan. His eyes went wide when he saw her, and for a moment they just stared at each other across the flickering fluorescent space. Mara must have looked like something dragged out of a grave. Her dark hair was a tangled mess of sweat and desert dust. Her feet left bloody prints on the linoleum. She was wearing Roy's oversized iron hound's vest, the leather swallowing her small frame, the snarling wolf emblem on the back partially obscured by dirt, and a fresh tear in the hide. "Lock the door?" Mara gasped, her voice cracking. "Please, just lock the door." Ethan Cole straightened up instantly alert. He did not panic. He did not ask a dozen useless questions. He simply looked at the terrified girl standing in front of him, then at the windows facing the empty highway, and walked out from behind the counter to flip the deadbolt on the glass door. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Do you need me to call someone?" Mara darted her eyes frantically toward the windows. Her chest was heaving each breath a ragged, painful wheeze. Before she could answer, the crunch of gravel outside announced the arrival of a vehicle. A battered matte black Dodge Ram skidded to a halt parallel to the gas pumps, kicking up a cloud of alkaline dust. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the station's interior like a prison spotlight. They had followed her tire tracks. They had followed the blood from her feet across the parking lot like a trail of breadcrumbs. Mara whimpered, shrinking down below the level of the window displays. She pressed her back against a cardboard rack of discount sunglasses, making herself as small as possible. The leather vest creaked softly around her shoulders, and she gripped the edges of it with white-knuckled hands, as if Roy himself could somehow protect her through the worn leather. 3 men piled out of the truck. Vincent Cross adjusted his belt, the heavy brass buckle catching the overhead light. He had a fresh cut above his left eye and a darkening bruise along his jaw. Roy's parting gifts. He walked toward the glass door with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his entire life taking what he wanted. Bull followed, cradling his right hand against his chest. Roy had hurt him too, but the giant was still moving, still dangerous, and the look on his face was one of barely contained rage. Needle brought up the rear, twitchy and wide-eyed, gnawing on his fingernails as he scanned the parking lot. Vincent tried the glass door, found it locked. He did not bother knocking. He yanked hard and the cheap deadbolt gave way with a splintering crack. The bell jingled its cheerful, idiotic tune. "Evening, kid," Vincent drawled, stepping inside. He did not look at Ethan. His predatory gaze was already sweeping the aisles of the small convenience store, hunting. "We saw a little stray dog wander in here wearing an oversized collar. You seen her?" Mara pressed herself tighter against the base of the sunglasses rack. She could see Ethan's sneakers from her hiding spot. They did not move. He was standing his ground behind the counter, directly between Vincent and the aisle where she was crouched. "Nobody here but me," Ethan said. His voice was surprisingly steady. He casually closed his algebra textbook as if he was simply clearing space on the counter. "Just trying to get through a shift." Bull scoffed, kicking over a display of motor oil near the door. The plastic bottles clattered across the linoleum floor like heavy, hollow drums. "Do not lie to us, you little punk!" Bull snarled, his voice thick with pain and fury. "We tracked her from the county line. The old man owes us a significant debt, and taking his precious daughter is going to ensure he pays up with interest." Mara felt her blood turn to ice water. They were not just after her to hurt her. She was leverage, a bargaining chip in a war she barely understood. If Vincent got hold of her, it would not just be kidnapping. It would be a death sentence, either hers or her father's, or both. "I do not know what you are talking about." Ethan lied again, stepping slightly to the left. Mara realized he was repositioning himself to better block their view of the sunglasses display. He was doing it deliberately, protecting her sightline. "If you guys want a coffee, it is fresh. Otherwise, I have got to ask you to leave. I am supposed to close up soon." Needle, the twitchy one, suddenly grinned. It was a horrible expression, exposing a row of decaying teeth. He pointed a dirt-stained finger toward the floor behind the counter. "Look at the dust, Vince. Little footprints, right there." The room went still. Mara stopped breathing. Vincent's eyes narrowed. Slowly, deliberately, he reached behind his back and pulled a heavy, serrated hunting knife from his belt. The blade was long and ugly, with a gut hook near the handle. It caught the fluorescent light and threw a cold blue reflection across the ceiling. "Kid," Vincent said, his tone dropping all pretense of civility. "Step aside. You are making minimum wage. You do not get paid enough to die tonight." From her hiding spot, Mara watched Ethan's sneakers. She willed them to move, to step aside. She was not worth this. She was a stranger to him, a girl who had run into his store and brought hell through the door behind her. He owed her nothing, less than nothing, but the sneakers did not move. Instead, she heard his voice, quiet and firm and absolutely certain. "She is not here." Something in those three words broke Mara's heart. It was not bravery. It was not defiance. It was simply a boy who had decided in the space between one heartbeat and the next what kind of man he wanted to be. And Mara, pressed against the floor of a dying gas station with three killers on the other side of a cardboard display, understood that decision with a clarity that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This stranger was going to bleed for her. Vincent sighed, a sound of genuine irritation. He nodded to Bull. "Move him." Bull lunged forward. He was easily 250 pounds of muscle and bad intentions, and even with an injured hand he reached across the counter and grabbed Ethan by the shirt collar with terrifying speed. Mara heard the sound before she understood what it was. A heavy metallic crack, like a baseball bat hitting a fence post. Ethan had grabbed something from beneath the register, a steel tire iron, and swung it in a vicious upward arc. The heavy metal connected with Bull's forearm with a sickening bone-deep crunch. Bull bellowed in agony, stumbling backward, his massive body crashing into a shelf of automotive supplies. Chaos erupted. Needle vaulted over the counter, with surprising speed, kicking the register off its base and sending coins flying in a metallic shower. Ethan swung the tire iron again, catching Needle in the ribs with a sound like someone dropping a watermelon on concrete. But Needle was fueled by something chemical and desperate. He tackled Ethan around the waist and they crashed backward into the shelving unit behind the counter. Bags of chips and candy rained down on them in an absurd crackling avalanche. "Run!" Ethan screamed. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Go out the back!" Mara scrambled to her feet. Her boots slipped on the motor oil that Bull had spilled near the door, and for one terrible second, she went down her knee, cracking against the linoleum. She pushed herself up and bolted toward the heavy steel door at the back of the store. The one marked "Employees Only." The one that led to the old mechanic's garage. Vincent saw her moving. His predator's eyes locked onto her retreating form, and he shoved past the counter, stepping over Bull's groaning body. "Get the girl!" he shouted, his voice rising for the first time. The calm, calculating mask was slipping. Behind her, Mara heard Ethan throw Needle off with a desperate heave. She heard him scramble to his feet. She heard the sound of his sneakers on the linoleum as he threw himself between Vincent and the doorway. "Get out of the way, kid!" Vincent snarled. Mara reached the steel door. She grabbed the handle. She pulled it open. And then she made the mistake of looking back. Ethan was standing in the narrow aisle between the counter and the wall. The tire iron raised his chest, heaving. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye where Needle had caught him with an elbow. He looked scared. He looked young. He looked exactly like what he was, a 17-year-old boy with a decent throwing arm and a good work ethic, standing between a killer and a stranger. Vincent thrust the hunting knife forward. Ethan tried to dodge, bringing the tire iron up to block, but the space was too narrow. There was nowhere to go. The cramped aisle betrayed him. Mara saw the knife go in. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a simple, brutal, mechanical motion. Vincent's arm extended. The blade disappeared into the left side of Ethan's abdomen, just below his ribs. There was no immediate spray of blood, no slow-motion collapse. Just a boy's expression changing from determination to confusion, as if his body had received a message that his brain had not yet translated. Then Vincent ripped the blade out, and everything turned red. Ethan gasped. The air left his lungs in a single terrible exhale. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his side. Dark, thick blood was already pulsing through his fingers, soaking his faded blue uniform shirt, spreading across the fabric with a speed that spoke of something vital and deep being cut. "No!" Mara screamed. The word tore itself from her throat without permission. She stood frozen in the doorway, the heavy steel door open behind her, watching as Ethan slid down the wall. He left a broad smear of crimson on the white paint like a brushstroke painted by gravity and violence. Vincent took another step forward, raising the bloody knife to finish the job. His face was blank, professional, a man completing a task. But Bull, still clutching his shattered arm, yelled from across the store. "Vince sirens, state troopers coming down the highway." Vincent froze. He cocked his head, listening. In the distance, the faintest wail of a siren drifted across the desert. He looked at Ethan, who was now sitting in a rapidly expanding pool of his own blood, his face draining of color like water running out of a sink. He looked at Mara, still standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, unable to move. "This is not over," Vincent spat. "We will be back for her." He looked at Ethan with something that might have been contempt, or might have been the faintest shadow of regret. "Let the kid bleed out." The three men scrambled out of the store, leaving a trail of bloody boot prints. Seconds later, the Dodge Ram tore out of the parking lot, its tires screaming against the asphalt. The sound faded into the night, and then there was nothing. The sirens Bull had heard were just a passing ambulance on the interstate miles away, answering someone else's emergency. It faded into silence. They were completely alone. Mara finally moved. She released the steel door and ran back into the store, dropping to her knees in the blood beside Ethan. Her hands found his pressing down on the wound. His blood was shockingly warm between her fingers. It pulsed with a rhythmic, insistent pressure that seemed to push back against her palms with every beat of his heart. "You are bleeding," Mara said, and she heard how stupid the words sounded even as she said them. "Oh God, you are bleeding so much." Ethan coughed. A metallic taste coated his tongue, and when he spoke his voice was incredibly weak, barely more than air shaped into words. "Lock the door, the big metal one. They will come back." Mara looked toward the front of the store. The glass door was hanging on its hinges, the deadbolt shattered. Beyond it, the parking lot was empty and dark. But she knew he was right. Vincent Cross was not the kind of man who left things unfinished. She had to move him. She could not leave him here, visible through the front windows, bleeding on the floor, like a wounded animal waiting for the hunter to return. Mara hooked her arms under Ethan's shoulders and pulled. He groaned a low animal sound that made her stomach clench. He was heavier than she expected, his body dead weight against the slick linoleum. She dragged him, leaving a horrific glistening trail of blood across the floor, through the employee's only door, and into the back mechanic's bay. The garage was dark. It smelled of old rubber gasoline and the particular kind of neglect that settles into buildings that have been forgotten by the world. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long trembling shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor. A hydraulic car lift stood in the center like a metal skeleton. Toolboxes lined the walls. An oil-changing pit, dark and narrow, was set into the floor beneath the lift. Mara slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the deadbolt. The metallic clang echoed through the enclosed space. She leaned against the door for a moment, her hands slick and red, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Then she turned and went back to Ethan. He was lying on his back, his head propped against a stack of discarded tires. His face was the color of old paper. The blue uniform shirt was completely soaked through, and the pool beneath him was spreading across the concrete with a slow, patient determination that terrified Mara more than the knife had. She found a stack of clean mechanic's rags on a nearby workbench and pressed a thick wad of them directly against the wound. Ethan hissed, his body jerking involuntarily, but she did not let up. She leaned her entire weight into her hands, remembering the first aid class she had taken at school, remembering the instructor's calm voice saying, "Direct pressure, keep pressure, do not let go." "I am going to call an ambulance," Mara said, pulling a battered smartphone from her jeans pocket with one bloody hand, while keeping pressure with the other. "No." Ethan's voice was a raspy whisper. His eyes were half closed and his breathing had become shallow and irregular. "Vincent has a police scanner. He pays off the local dispatch. They will intercept the ambulance. Finish us both." Mara stared at him in horror. The corruption in Oak Haven ran deep. She knew this. She had grown up hearing her father talk about dirty cops and bought judges and the particular kind of rot that settled into small desert towns where there was too much money flowing through and not enough people watching. If she called 911, the dispatcher would log the call. Vincent's scanner would pick it up. He would know exactly where they were and exactly when help was coming. "Then what do I do?" Mara begged, her hands cramping from the sustained pressure, her fingers disappearing into the warm, wet mess of cloth and blood. "You are dying. You saved me and you are dying." Ethan's eyes found hers. Even through the pain, even through the encroaching fog, there was a startling clarity in them. "Call your dad," he managed to say. 3 words, and they hit Mara like a physical blow. "Call your dad. Call Silas Gallagher. Call Iron Silas. Call the man whose world she had spent her entire life trying to keep at arm's length. Call the violence. Call the thunder. Call the thing she feared most, not because it would hurt her, but because once she invited it in, she could never pretend she was separate from it again. This was the choice. Not whether to call. She knew she had to call. The choice was what it meant. If she dialed that number, she was not just asking for help. She was stepping across a line she had drawn in the sand of her own identity years ago. She was admitting that the world of leather and iron and blood was not just her father's world. It was hers too. It had always been hers. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from the fear, from the weight of what she was about to do. She unlocked her phone. The screen was smeared with Ethan's blood, the glass slippery beneath her thumb. She navigated to her contacts with the practiced muscle memory of a girl who had called this number 1,000 times before for homework questions and goodnight calls, and the occasional tearful argument about curfews and freedom, and the suffocating weight of being Iron Silas's daughter. She pressed the green button. It rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered, casual, slightly tired. The voice of a man who was probably sitting in his study nursing a glass of whiskey and reviewing the week's business. "Yeah, Dad." The word came out as a sob. All the steel she had been forcing into her spine collapsed at once. She was not a girl making a strategic decision anymore. She was a child calling for her father in the dark. "Dad, it is me." The voice on the other end shifted instantly. The casual warmth evaporated, replaced by something sharp and focused and terrifying in its intensity. "Mara, where are you? The boys have been tearing the county apart looking for Roy's truck." "I'm at the Sinclair station on Route 9, just outside Oak Haven." She was crying openly now, her words tumbling over each other. "Vincent Cross and his guys found me. They ambushed Uncle Roy on the back road. Dad, I do not know if Roy is okay. They tried to grab me, but Roy told me to run and I ran, and there was this boy at the gas station. Dad, he fought them." A heavy, terrifying silence on the line. "Did they touch you?" Silas asked. His voice had dropped to a register that Mara had never heard before. It was quiet, almost gentle, and it was the most dangerous sound she had ever encountered. "No!" Mara cried, looking down at Ethan. His breathing was becoming shallow and ragged, each exhale carrying a faint, wet rattle that she instinctively knew was very, very bad. "No, but the boy, Dad, the kid working the counter." He stepped in front of the knife. "He put himself between me and Vincent. He is stabbed. He is bleeding out. I have pressure on it, but there is so much blood. She swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. Dad, we cannot call an ambulance. Vincent owns the dispatch. You know he does. If I call 911, his guys will be waiting at the hospital doors. Another beat of silence. 1 second. 2. Then Mara heard a sound that traveled through the phone line and lodged itself in the base of her spine like a splinter of ice. It was the sound of a heavy leather jacket being pulled off the back of a chair, the sharp hiss of a zipper being drawn closed, the creak of old leather settling onto broad shoulders like armor. Hold the pressure on his wound, sweetheart, Silas Gallagher said. His voice was no longer quiet. It was resonant, commanding, carrying the weight of absolute, terrifying authority. The voice of a man who had led 200 men through fire and blood and never once looked back. Tell that boy to hold on. We are 20 minutes out. A pause. When he spoke again, each word landed like a hammer on an anvil. We are bringing the whole chapter. The line went dead. Mara dropped the phone onto the concrete floor. She leaned over Ethan, pressing her entire body weight against his side, both hands buried in the sodden rags. Her forehead nearly touched his. She could see every detail of his face in the harsh light of the bare bulb. The freckles on his nose, the slight cleft in his chin, the way his eyelashes fluttered as he fought to stay conscious. Stay with me, she pleaded. My dad is coming. Do you hear me? You just have to hold on. Your dad. Ethan mumbled his words, slurring together. Iron Silas, the whole chapter. Yes. A faint, delirious smile crossed his bloodless lips. That is a lot of motorcycles. Mara let out a choked laugh that was 90% sob. You have no idea. Tell me your name. Ethan whispered. His eyes were starting to glaze. You got me stabbed and I do not even know your name. Mara. Mara Gallagher. Mara. He tasted the word like he was trying to memorize it before the lights went out. That is nice. Why did you come to my gas station, Mara? Bad luck, she said, pressing harder on the wound. He winced, a low groan vibrating in his chest. The worst luck in the world. No, Ethan whispered. His bloody hand found hers atop the wound and squeezed weakly. Not the worst. Time stretched. Minutes became hours, became an eternity of blood and pressure and whispered conversation in the dark. Mara kept Ethan talking, desperate to keep him tethered to the waking world. She asked him about his life, his family, anything that would make him keep using his voice. He told her about his mother Lorraine, about her bad heart and the medications that cost more than he earned, about the diner where she worked until her body would not let her anymore, about the snickerdoodles she baked when she was feeling well, filling the house with the warm, sweet smell of cinnamon and butter. He told her about working the graveyard shift to keep the electricity running, about the algebra textbook he could never focus on because the numbers kept turning into dollar signs in his head. When we get out of here, Mara said, her voice cracking but fierce, I'm going to eat a whole dozen of those cookies, you and me, deal? Ethan's eyes were closing. His skin was growing colder beneath her hands, the warmth retreating inward as his body began the ancient involuntary calculus of survival, pulling blood away from the extremities, hoarding whatever remained for the heart and the brain. His lips carried a faint, terrifying blue tint that had not been there an hour ago. Deal, he breathed. Outside, the desert was silent and still. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the blood being spilled beneath them. The Sinclair station sat alone on Route 9, a small box of dying fluorescent light in an ocean of black. But 20 miles to the south, something was moving, something massive and loud and furious. Kickstands were being slammed upward, throttles were being twisted until the engine screamed. Heavy leather vests were being pulled over broad, scarred shoulders. Weapons were being checked and holstered with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. 200 engines roared to life simultaneously. The ground trembled. and a rolling wave of iron leather and vengeance began to move through the desert night, aimed like a loaded weapon at the small dying gas station on Route 9, where a girl held a stranger's life between her bloody hands and prayed for dawn. The digital clock on the garage wall, partially obscured by a hanging fan belt, glowed red in the darkness. 3:55 in the morning. Almost 2 hours since the knife. Almost 2 hours since Mara had dragged Ethan across the linoleum and into this dark, oily tomb that smelled of old rubber and gasoline, and the particular kind of neglect that settles into places the world has forgotten. "Keep your eyes open," Mara demanded. Her voice was shaking, but there was something underneath the tremor, an undeniable fierce command that she had inherited from a man she was only now beginning to understand. "Ethan, look at me! Keep your eyes open!" Ethan tried. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead. Every blink lasted longer than the last, the darkness between each one growing warmer and more inviting. The pain had evolved. The initial sharp, agonizing stab had morphed into a dull, rhythmic thumping that synced perfectly with his fading heartbeat. "I am trying," he whispered. "It is just really heavy. My eyelids, I mean." "Then talk to me," Mara said. Her hands were cramping badly now, the sustained pressure sending bolts of fire through her forearms and into her shoulders. The mechanic's rags beneath her palms were completely saturated, and she had layered fresh ones on top twice already. But the blood kept coming slow and insistent, like a faucet that could not be fully closed. "Tell me about those cookies again, the snickerdoodles." "Cinnamon," Ethan mumbled, his words running together at the edges. "Mom rolls them in cinnamon and sugar. The house smells like Christmas even in July. She only bakes when she's feeling good, though, when her heart is cooperating." "Tell me about a good day." Mara pressed, adjusting her grip. Her fingers slipped in the crimson mess, and she repositioned them with a surgeon's focus, finding the spot where the pressure seemed to slow the bleeding the most. "A day when she baked." Ethan was quiet for a moment. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, and Mara thought she had lost him. But then he spoke, his voice carrying a fragile, distant quality, like a radio signal fading in and out. "Last Thanksgiving, she woke up feeling strong. That does not happen much anymore. She made a whole batch before I even got out of bed. When I came downstairs, she was standing at the counter in her old blue apron, the one with the sunflowers on it, and she was humming. I had not heard her hum in months." He coughed. A wet, rattling sound that made Mara flinch. A thin line of red appeared at the corner of his mouth. "She looked up at me and said, 'Sit down, baby. Breakfast cookies.' Like it was the most normal thing in the world. Like she was not sick. Like we were not behind on the electric bill. Like everything was just fine." His bloody hand found Mara's wrist and held it weakly. "That is what I think about when I'm working these shifts." That morning, her humming. Mara blinked hard, forcing the tears back. She could not afford to cry. If she cried, her hands would shake. If her hands shook, the pressure would slip. If the pressure slipped, Ethan Cole would die on this floor, and his mother would never hum again. "You are going to hear her hum again," Mara said, and she made it sound like a fact, like gravity, like something the universe had no choice but to honor. "My dad is coming, and when he gets here, he's going to make sure your mom has the best doctors in Nevada. You hear me? But you have to stay alive to collect." "Your dad," Ethan breathed. "The biker king." "The biker king," Mara confirmed, "and he does not lose people." 23 miles to the southeast, in a rusted scrapyard office that smelled of motor oil and stale cigarettes, the atmosphere was considerably less tender. Vincent Cross kicked the office door shut with enough force to send a shower of flaking paint onto the dirt floor. His hands were still trembling, not from fear, from adrenaline and from the nagging, corrosive voice in the back of his skull that kept whispering that he had made a critical mistake. He had left the girl alive. He had left a witness alive. And now the clock was ticking. A disheveled man in a blood-stained apron was tightly wrapping a fiberglass splint around Bull's forearm. Bull sat on an overturned crate, sweating profusely, his face pale and waxy from the shock of the shattered bone that a 17-year-old gas station attendant had delivered via tire iron. Every few seconds, Bull let out a low animal moan that vibrated the tools hanging on the wall. Needle paced near the window, gnawing on his fingernails with the intensity of a man trying to eat his own hands. "Vince, this is bad." He muttered, his words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "This is real bad. We left a mess. If that kid bleeds out, that is a murder rap. Not just county boys looking for us. The feds. Interstate kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, murder of a minor. That is federal death row territory. Shut up, Needle. I'm serious, Vince. Roy Gallagher is dead in a ditch on Route 14. We got a stabbed kid in a gas station. We got the daughter of Iron Silas running around out there as a witness. This thing is unraveling." Vincent stopped pacing. He turned slowly and looked at Needle with an expression that made the twitchy man take 2 involuntary steps backward. "I said shut up." The room went quiet except for Bull's moaning and the distant hum of a generator running on fumes somewhere behind the building. Vincent ran a hand over his shaved head. His mind was calculating angles, running probabilities, weighing options with the cold mechanical efficiency that had kept him alive and operational in the criminal underworld of rural Nevada for over a decade. He was not a stupid man. That was what made him dangerous. He was capable of cruelty, but it was always calculated cruelty, always in service of a larger play. The larger play right now was survival. He owed money, a great deal of money, to men who made him look like a schoolyard bully by comparison. Men in Phoenix who had fronted him $500,000 worth of product that had been seized by the DEA 3 weeks ago in a raid that Vincent suspected the Iron Hounds had orchestrated. The Phoenix men did not care about excuses. They did not care about raids or rivals or the complex politics of rural Nevada. They cared about repayment. And they had given Vincent 72 hours to produce either the cash or something of equivalent value. Silas Gallagher's daughter was that equivalent value. With Mara in hand, Vincent could force Silas to surrender the Iron Hound's smuggling routes through the desert corridor. Routes worth millions annually, enough to pay back the Phoenix men and then some. Without Mara, Vincent was a dead man walking. The Phoenix crew would come for him within the week. So the calculation was simple, even if the execution had gotten messy. "We go back," Vincent said finally, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "We have to. If she calls Gallagher, we are finished. All of us." Bull groaned, clutching his newly splintered arm. "Vince, what if the cops are already there?" Vincent walked over to the police scanner sitting on a cluttered shelf near the desk. He adjusted the squelch, listening to the static crackle of the county dispatch frequency. Empty, dead air. Nothing but the occasional bored voice reporting a welfare check on the other side of the county. "I've had the scanner on since we left," Vincent said, a cold, predatory calm spreading across his face. "Dispatch has not squawked a single word about a stabbing on Route 9. That means they have not called it in. The kid is probably dead and the girl is hiding in that back room, too scared to make a move." He walked to a heavy metal gun safe in the corner and spun the combination lock. The heavy door swung open with a groan. Inside, arranged with military precision, were several weapons. Vincent retrieved a matte black tactical shotgun and tossed a box of shells to Needle. "Load it up." Then he walked to a cluttered workbench against the far wall and hefted a heavy dual-tank acetylene cutting torch. He tested the igniter. A bright blue flame hissed to life, then died as he released the trigger. "They locked themselves in the mechanic's bay," Vincent said. "Heavy steel door with a deadbolt. We are going to cut the lock, grab the Gallagher girl, and put a bullet in the kid to make sure there are no witnesses. Clean and done." Needle swallowed hard, catching the box of shells with fumbling hands. His face was the color of old newspaper. "And if Iron Silas shows up..." Vincent's eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. Then we make sure we have his daughter with a gun to her head before he gets off his bike. Bull had gone very still on his crate. Something had shifted behind the big man's eyes. A calculation of his own quieter and more personal than Vincent's. Bull had followed Vincent for 6 years, through deals and beatings and the slow corrosive accumulation of sins that defined their particular line of work. But this felt different. This felt like a cliff edge. "My arm is shattered, Vince." Bull said, his words measured and careful. "I cannot hold a weapon. I cannot drive. I am no good to you out there." Vincent stared at him for a long, cold moment. Then he turned away. "Stay here then. Guard the yard. If anyone comes asking questions, you have not seen us tonight." Vincent and Needle walked out into the warm desert night. The Dodge Ram's engine coughed to life. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as they pulled out of the scrapyard and turned east toward Route 9. Bull sat alone in the office, cradling his broken arm, listening to the engine fade. He looked at the police scanner. He looked at the phone on the desk. He did not make a call, but he did not go back to sleep either. He just sat there in the dark, waiting for something he could not name, feeling the cliff edge beneath his feet. Inside the Sinclair garage, time had become meaningless. The clock on the wall said 4:12. Mara's arms were trembling from the effort of maintaining pressure. Her back ached. Her knees pressed into the hard concrete had gone numb 20 minutes ago. But she did not move. She did not shift. She did not adjust. Ethan was shivering violently now, his body entering the deep systemic shock of massive blood loss. His lips were blue. Mara had draped her heavy leather Iron Hound's vest over his chest, but it was not enough. Nothing external could fight the cold that was consuming him from within. She had stopped asking him to talk. His responses had become single words, then syllables, then just faint movements of his head. He was still conscious, she thought. His eyes were still partially open, tracking the light of the bare bulb above them. But he was drifting. She could feel it. He was a boat whose anchor rope was fraying thread by thread, and each passing minute snapped another strand. 8 more minutes? Mara whispered, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. She had been saying it for the last 30 minutes. 8 more minutes. 7 more minutes. Almost there. "They are almost here, Ethan. I can feel it." She could not feel anything except his blood. Then the garage was suddenly flooded with light. Harsh, blinding white light swept across the frosted glass windows at the top of the bay doors. Headlights. They painted long, terrifying shadows across the concrete floor, stretching the silhouette of the hydraulic lift into a grotesque skeletal shape that climbed the far wall. Mara froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. The rumble of a heavy diesel engine cut through the silence, followed by the sickening crunch of boots on gravel. "They are back," Ethan whispered. His eyes had snapped open suddenly, bright with adrenaline and terror. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his abdomen that slammed him flat. He gasped, his back arching off the floor, and for a terrible moment, Mara thought the effort had killed him. "Stay down," she hissed, pressing him gently but firmly back against the concrete. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She looked around the garage with desperate, darting eyes. A weapon, a hiding spot, anything. The garage was a concrete box, no windows large enough to crawl through, no back door. The only exit was the heavy steel door she had bolted, and the large bay door facing the parking lot. There was the hydraulic lift, a few metal toolboxes, the oil-changing pit, dark and narrow, set into the floor beneath the lift, and on the floor near the base of the lift, a heavy metal pipe wrench. 18 inches of forged steel crusted with old grease. Heavy footsteps echoed inside the convenience store on the other side of the steel door. Then the sound of glass shattering. Vincent's crew was not bothering with the front entrance anymore. They had smashed through the front window entirely. A moment later, a heavy fist pounded against the steel door. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the enclosed space, and Mara felt it in her chest. "Open up, little piggies." Vincent's voice muffled through the heavy metal, dripping with cruel amusement. "We know you are in there. I have got a scanner, kids. No ambulances dispatched. No cops coming. You are all alone. Mara squeezed her eyes shut. Dad, please. Please hurry. You want to do this the hard way, Vincent yelled. Fine by me, needle fire it up. A loud aggressive hiss echoed through the door, followed immediately by the sharp crackling roar of an acetylene torch igniting. Mara watched in horror as a small circle of metal near the deadbolt began to change color. First it turned a dull, bruised purple, then a bright, angry cherry red. The heat radiating from the door was instantaneous and intense, rolling across the garage in waves that made the air shimmer. Vincent Cross was cutting straight through the locking mechanism. Mara moved. She did not think. She acted. She pulled her blood-soaked hands away from Ethan's wound, ignoring his weak groan of protest, and scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees. She grabbed the pipe wrench from beside the hydraulic lift. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. The forged steel was cold in her hands, and she gripped it with both fists, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched. Then she went back to Ethan. She crouched beside him, pressing the wadded rags back against his wound, with one hand holding the wrench in the other. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing circle of metal near the deadbolt. It was growing. The molten edges were dripping now, bright white-hot flakes of liquid steel raining down on the linoleum on the other side with tiny hissing splashes. Mara! Ethan's voice was barely audible. Hide! Get in the pit! He was looking at the oil-changing pit. The dark, narrow rectangle cut into the concrete floor beneath the hydraulic lift. It was maybe 4 feet deep, filled with filthy runoff water and old rags. It would be cramped, foul, and completely hidden from view if she pulled something over the opening. I'm not leaving you, Mara said. They want you, Ethan insisted. His voice found a surprising reserve of firmness, as if the proximity of death had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the essential truth. If they get you, my dying means nothing. Everything I did tonight means nothing. He had managed to roll onto his stomach while she was getting the wrench. Now he dragged himself a few inches across the floor, his bloody fingers reaching for the pipe wrench in her hand. He left a thick smear trail of red behind him, like some terrible painting being created by gravity and desperation. Give me the wrench, he said. Get in the pit, now. The lock on the steel door began to spark violently. Bright white hot fragments scattered across the floor, almost through. Mara could hear Vincent laughing on the other side, a low, ugly sound full of certainty. Mara looked at Ethan, really looked at him, at the boy who had taken a knife for a stranger, who had dragged his dying body across concrete to buy her a few more seconds, who was now asking her for a weapon he could barely lift so he could face a killer while she hid in a hole. She understood then with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it, and it was not limited to the person holding the weapon. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust someone else's sacrifice and make sure it was not wasted. She handed him the wrench. His bloody fingers closed around the handle. He could not lift it more than a few inches off the ground, but he held it, his knuckles white, his jaw set. Do not die, Mara whispered. Go. Mara slid down into the oil-changing pit. The water at the bottom was cold and foul, soaking through her jeans instantly. The pit smelled of petroleum and rust and decay. She pulled a piece of heavy cardboard over the opening, covering herself in darkness. Through a narrow gap between the cardboard and the concrete rim, she could see a thin slice of the garage floor. She could see Ethan's hand. She could see the pipe wrench. She could see the door. The deadbolt gave way with a loud metallic clang that resonated through the concrete like a bell. The heavy steel door swung open, crashing against the cinder block wall. Vincent Cross stepped into the garage. The smoking acetylene torch was in his left hand, the heavy hunting knife in his right. His silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the fluorescent light of the ransacked convenience store behind him. Needle followed closely, the tactical shotgun leveled at his shoulder, his hands trembling badly enough to make the barrel waver. Vincent's eyes swept the room. He found the trail of blood immediately, followed it with the calm, methodical gaze of a tracker, reading sign in the dirt. His eyes stopped when he saw Ethan. The boy was lying on his stomach, painfully propping himself up on one elbow, the pipe wrench clutched in his right hand. His uniform shirt was black with blood. Vincent chuckled, a low, ugly sound that bounced off the concrete walls. Kid, you have got a lot of heart. I will give you that. But heart does not stop bullets. Ethan did not speak. He just stared at Vincent, his jaw clenched, waiting. Vincent shut off the acetylene torch and set it on the floor. He stepped forward, the knife catching the light of the bare bulb. Where is the girl, kid? Tell me and I will make this quick. Go to hell. Ethan's voice was barely audible, but the words were perfectly clear. A thin line of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, and he did not bother to wipe it away. Vincent sighed, the sound of a man who had exhausted his patience. He took another step, raising the blade. Have it your way. From the darkness of the pit, Mara watched through the narrow gap. She saw Vincent's boots moving across the concrete. She saw the knife rising. She saw Ethan's hand tighten on the wrench, gathering whatever strength remained in his failing body for one last futile swing. She gripped the edges of the pit. Every instinct screamed at her to climb out, to attack, to throw herself between them. But Ethan's voice echoed in her head, clear and absolute. If they get you, my dying means nothing. She stayed, she watched, and she prayed. Vincent took one more step. The knife reached its apex, and then the world began to vibrate. It did not start as a sound. It started as a sensation. A tremor that traveled up through the concrete floor, through the stagnant water in the pit, through Mara's bones and into her chest. She felt it before she heard it. A deep subsonic pulse, like the heartbeat of something enormous waking up beneath the earth. Vincent froze. The knife hung suspended in the air. He looked down at his boots. The loose dust on the concrete floor was beginning to dance, shimmering and jumping in tiny, frantic patterns. The tools hanging on the pegboard walls rattled against their hooks. A socket wrench fell from its peg and clattered to the floor. Needle lowered the shotgun slightly, his twitchy eyes darting around the garage. Vince! His voice cracked. Vince, what is that? An earthquake? The vibration intensified. The bare bulb overhead swung on its wire, sending the shadows into a slow, nauseating rotation. A jar of nails fell from the workbench and shattered against the floor. Then the sound arrived. It was not the high-pitched wail of sirens. It was not the rumble of a passing truck. It was a deep, guttural, synchronized roar that rolled across the desert floor, like thunder that refused to fade. It grew, it swelled, it multiplied. It became a physical force, a wall of noise that pressed against the walls of the garage and made the air itself feel heavy and compressed. It was the sound of heavy American iron, straight pipes and high-octane fuel, V-twin engines screaming at redline, not one or two or 10, but scores of them, then hundreds. A mechanical chorus of 200 individual voices howling in perfect, terrifying unison. Vincent Cross's face drained of color. Mara watched from the pit as the predatory confidence evaporated from his body like water on hot pavement. He turned slowly toward the frosted windows of the bay door. The darkness outside was suddenly pierced by light, not two headlights, not four, a wall of light, a blinding horizontal sunrise that had no business existing at 4:30 in the morning. The noise grew until it was no longer noise, but atmosphere, a physical medium that surrounded the gas station and pressed against every surface. The windows rattled violently against their frames. The cinder block walls hummed. Needle dropped the shotgun. The weapon clattered against the oil-stained floor, forgotten. He pressed his hands over his ears, backing away until his spine hit the workbench. Vince! He screamed, his voice barely audible over the apocalyptic wall of sound. Vince, they are here! The hounds are here! Vincent stood paralyzed. The hunting knife trembled in his hand. Through the frosted glass, he could see silhouettes. enormous shapes dismounting from their machines with the slow, unhurried movements of men who owned the ground they stood on. The beams from 100 headlamps cut through the night, casting long distorted shadows that climbed the walls of the Sinclair station like the fingers of some vast and reaching hand. Iron Silas had arrived, and he had brought hell with him. Outside, a heavy diesel-powered tow truck, painted the same matte black as the Iron Hound's motorcycles, backed up to the garage bay door. A massive man with a braided gray beard leaped from the flatbed, hauling a thick logging chain over his shoulder. He moved with practiced, brutal efficiency, hooking the forged steel links directly to the bottom handle of the bay door. Inside, Vincent snapped out of his paralysis. Survival instinct overrode everything else. He spun toward the pit where Mara was hiding, desperate for a human shield. If he had the girl, he had leverage. If he had the girl, even Iron Silas would have to negotiate. He lunged forward, dropping the knife and clawing at the heavy cardboard covering the opening. His fingers caught the edge. He began to pull. He never finished. The diesel truck outside slammed into gear. The logging chain pulled taut with a sickening metallic shriek. In a single violent motion, the entire aluminum bay door was ripped clean off its tracks. The metal tore like wet paper. The deafening crunch of shearing aluminum and snapping bolts echoed through the small space as the entire door was dragged out into the parking lot, crumpling and folding like tinfoil. A suffocating cloud of alkaline dust, exhaust fumes, and pulverized concrete billowed into the mechanic's bay. The harsh, blinding glare of 100 headlights flooded the room, turning the darkness into a searing white-hot stage. Every shadow was annihilated. Every corner was exposed. The garage, which had been a sealed tomb moments ago, was suddenly as open and exposed as a theater, with its curtain torn away. Through the swirling dust, figures began to emerge. They did not rush in like police officers executing a raid. They walked. They moved with the slow, deliberate swagger of men who had crossed deserts and buried enemies, and never once apologized for the lives they had lived. A creeping tide of scarred leather, worn denim, and heavy boots. Each man was enormous. Each man wore the snarling wolf emblem on his chest. Each man's eyes carried the flat, calm certainty of absolute violence held in perfect reserve. And at the center of the formation, eclipsing them all, stood a man who seemed to swallow the light. Silas Gallagher, Iron Silas. He was a giant. 6 feet 4 inches of scarred, weathered, indestructible authority. His face was a topographic map of old violence, crisscrossed with faded white scars that told stories no one had the courage to ask about. His dark eyes burned with a cold, terrifying calculation beneath heavy brows. He wore a heavily weathered leather, cut the snarling wolf patch prominent on his chest, flanked by the coveted President rocker. His hands hung at his sides loose and ready, and they were the hands of a man who had broken things that were meant to be unbreakable. Silas stepped over the ruined threshold of the garage. 200 idling motorcycles provided a menacing, rumbling soundtrack to his silent entrance. 2 massive enforcers' men named Clayton and Pike flanked him, their hands resting on the heavy leather holsters at their hips. Vincent froze. His hands were still hovering over the edge of the pit. The blood drained entirely from his face. He looked like a man who had just opened a door and found the devil standing on his doorstep. Silas. Vincent's voice cracked. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. Silas, listen to me. This is a misunderstanding. We were just... Iron Silas did not say a word. He did not blink. He simply looked at Vincent Cross with an expression that contained no anger, no rage, no heat of any kind. It was colder than that. It was the expression of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply waiting for the universe to catch up with his decision. He nodded his head a fraction of an inch to the left. Clayton and Pike moved. They crossed the room with terrifying speed, covering the distance in 3 strides. Pike grabbed Needle by the throat, hoisting the twitchy man off his feet and slamming him against the cinder block wall. The impact cracked the mortar between the blocks. Clayton, a man built like a bank vault, wrapped his massive hands around Vincent's jacket, lifted him entirely off the floor, and hurled him backward. Vincent crashed into a stack of radial tires, gasping the wind driven from his lungs. Silas ignored the violence behind him. His dark, piercing eyes swept the room, searching through the dust and the blood. Mara. His voice was not a shout. It was a deep, resonant rumble that carried over the sound of the engines like a bass note cutting through static. It was the voice of a man who had called this name 1,000 times. At bedtime, at breakfast, across crowded rooms and empty hallways and the vast, lonely distances that separated a father from the daughter he was trying to protect from his own shadow. The heavy cardboard over the pit shifted. Mara pushed it aside slowly. Her face appeared above the rim, smeared with greased hairs and Ethan Cole's blood. Her dark hair was matted to her forehead. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked up at the towering figure of her father, and her lower lip began to tremble in a way that she could not control. "Dad," she sobbed. Silas Gallagher's stoic facade cracked. For a single unguarded moment, the terrifying biker president vanished completely. The scarred face softened, the dark eyes filled with something raw and desperate and agonizingly human. He crossed the room in two massive strides, dropping to his knees on the oil-stained concrete, and pulled his daughter out of the pit and into a fiercely protective embrace. He buried his face in her hair. His massive shoulders shook, just once, just slightly, but enough for Mara to feel it. Enough for her to understand that the most dangerous man in 3 states had been terrified tonight. Not of bullets or blades or rival gangs, of losing her. "I got you, baby girl." Silas whispered, his voice thick and rough. "I got you. Nobody's ever going to touch you again." Mara clung to his leather vest, her fists clenching the worn fabric, sobbing into his chest with the complete shattered abandon of a child who has finally reached safety after walking through fire. She smelled leather and engine oil and the faint trace of whiskey, and it smelled like home. But even in her relief, even in the overwhelming flood of safety and exhaustion and love, Mara did not forget. She pulled back slightly. Her hands grabbed her father's thick forearms. She turned her head toward the corner of the room where the bare bulb cast its harsh light on a spreading pool of dark red. "Dad, you have to help him," Mara cried, pointing with a trembling finger. "He stepped in front of the knife. He put himself between me and Vincent. He is dying, Dad. He saved me and he is dying." Silas Gallagher stood up. The protective father vanished as quickly as he had appeared, replaced by the battlefield commander. He turned his gaze toward the shadows beneath the hydraulic lift. There, lying in a vast spreading pool of his own blood, was Ethan Cole. The boy's eyes were barely open. The harsh glare of the motorcycle headlights was fading into a comfortable, inviting gray in his dimming vision. The pipe wrench was still clutched in his pale, trembling hand. He had not let go. Silas walked over and knelt beside the boy. The floorboards vibrated under his weight. Ethan tried to focus. The face swimming into view was terrifying, framed by scars and hard eyes and the kind of authority that bends the world around it. "Kid," Silas rumbled. Ethan blinked. His lips moved. "I kept the door locked," he whispered, "as long as I could." Silas looked at the horrific knife wound beneath the boy's ribs, then at the pipe wrench still clutched in Ethan's hand, then at the smear of blood across the floor, the evidence of a boy who had dragged his dying body across concrete to buy a stranger's daughter a few more seconds of life. Respect settled into Silas Gallagher's dark eyes, absolute and unwavering. In the violent tribal world of the Iron Hounds, courage was the highest currency, and this minimum wage kid had just bought out the bank. "Hawk!" Silas roared over his shoulder, his voice cracking through the dust like a cannon shot. "Get in here, now!" A wiry, heavily tattooed man pushed through the crowd of bikers at the ruined doorway. Hawk carried a massive olive-drab canvas medical bag. He had served 2 tours as a combat medic in Fallujah before trading his desert camo for black leather. He dropped to his knees beside Ethan, tearing the bag open with practiced mechanical speed. "He's crashing, boss," Hawk muttered, his hands moving with blinding precision. He ripped Ethan's blood-soaked uniform shirt open, exposing the pale skin and the gaping, ragged puncture wound. Blade missed the lung, but it nicked a vein. He is bleeding out internally. I need to pack this now. Fix him, Silas ordered. I need pressure, hard pressure. Hawk barked, pulling out a thick roll of hemostatic gauze designed to clot traumatic battlefield wounds. Hold him down. This is going to hurt. Heavy leather-clad hands pinned Ethan's shoulders and legs to the floor. Hawk packed the medicated gauze directly into the stab wound with 2 fingers, pushing it deep into the tissue. Ethan's eyes flew open in a silent scream. His body convulsed against the hands, holding him, every muscle firing at once in a desperate involuntary protest against the searing agony. Look at me, son. Silas leaned in close, his scarred face filling Ethan's field of vision. Look at me. My name is Silas. You protected my blood tonight. That means you are my blood now. And iron hounds do not die on this floor. You hear me? You stay in this fight. Ethan locked eyes with the terrifying biker king. The sheer overwhelming force of Silas Gallagher's will seemed to reach through the fog and the cold and the slow seductive pull of unconsciousness and grab hold of something vital, something stubborn, something that refused. Ethan gritted his teeth and nodded. IV is in. Hawk announced, securing a heavy needle into the crook of Ethan's arm and squeezing a bag of saline. But I've got the bleed temporarily packed, but he needs a surgeon. 10 minutes ago. If we wait for a helicopter, he is dead. Silas stood slowly. He looked at Mara, who was being shielded by 3 massive bikers near the ruined doorway. Then he looked across the room. Clayton still held Vincent Cross suspended against the far wall. The scrapyard boss was weeping openly, his boots kicking uselessly at the air. Clayton, Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. Throw that piece of trash in the trunk. Take his twitchy friend, too. Silas, please! Vincent shrieked, struggling wildly. I will give you the scrapyard. I will give you the roots. I will give you everything, please. You put a blade in a boy who was protecting my daughter, Silas stated, adjusting the cuffs of his leather jacket with the calm precision of a man straightening his tie before a business meeting. Your roots belong to me anyway, and your life ended the second you touched my blood. Clayton did not hesitate. He slammed a massive fist into Vincent's jaw with a sound like a cinder block hitting wet earth. The scrapyard boss went limp instantly. Clayton threw the unconscious man over his shoulder and carried him out into the sea of motorcycles and light. Pike dragged a sobbing needle out by his collar. Mara watched them go. She knew where they were being taken. She knew what would happen in the deep, silent reaches of the Nevada desert. And for the first time in her life, she did not look away from that knowledge. She did not pretend it was not happening. She held it in her mind and weighed it against the image of Ethan Cole's blood spreading across the linoleum floor, and she found that the scales balanced in a way she had not expected. Silas turned back to his men. His voice rose above the rumble of idling engines. Mount up! We are taking the interstate. I want a rolling blockade. Nothing gets past us. We are taking this boy to Oak Haven General, and we are going to own the highway. Hawk and another biker carefully lifted Ethan onto a makeshift stretcher, fashioned from a heavy canvas tarp. Mara walked beside them as they carried him out of the shattered garage and into the suffocating August night. The heat of 200 engines washed over her like a furnace blast. She climbed into the back of the black diesel tow truck alongside Hawk. Nobody tried to stop her. Ethan was loaded carefully into the truck bed. Hawk adjusted the IV line with one hand and kept pressure on the wound with the other. The portable vital monitor he had rigged to the dashboard showed a heart rate that was flattening into a chaotic, jagged scribble. Silas Gallagher walked to his custom midnight black chopper. He swung his leg over the saddle, the heavy suspension groaning beneath his weight. He looked back at the tow truck, then raised his right hand high into the air. 200 bikers kicked their machines into gear simultaneously. The noise was beyond description. It shook the dirt from the Sinclair station's awning and sent tremors through the concrete foundation of the building. Silas dropped his hand. The iron hounds surged forward onto Route 9. They did not obey the speed limit. They did not stop for red lights. They formed a massive impenetrable V formation across all 4 lanes of the interstate, a rolling wall of steel and leather shielding the diesel truck at its center. The formation was perfect, each rider maintaining exact spacing with the mechanical precision of a military convoy. In the back of the truck, Hawk worked with desperate, controlled urgency. He had both hands deep in Ethan's side, pinching off a severed tributary, while simultaneously trying to keep the hemostatic gauze in place against the relentless bounce of the truck over unmaintained Nevada roads. The green line on the portable monitor was erratic, a jagged scrawl that spoke of a heart struggling to maintain rhythm against impossible odds. "Stay with me, Cole!" Hawk barked, his voice strained but steady. He glanced at Mara. "Keep talking to him. Keep him anchored." Mara took Ethan's cold hand in both of hers. His skin was ice. She squeezed. "Ethan, we are almost there. Stay with me. Stay with me." 10 miles ahead, a state trooper named Thomas Dawson was parked behind a rusted billboard fighting off sleep with a lukewarm thermos of black coffee. His radar gun sat dormant on the dashboard. Route 9 was historically dead at this hour. Suddenly, the radar gun emitted a sharp, continuous shriek. The digital display flashed 85, then 95, before maxing out and blinking rapidly. Dawson dropped his coffee, spilling it across his pressed uniform trousers. He grabbed his radio mic, kicking his cruiser into drive. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have got a massive speed violation heading northbound on 9. Sounds like a convoy." Static crackled. The dispatcher hesitated. "Unit 4, copy that. Proceed with caution. We have no scheduled convoys." Dawson pulled out from behind the billboard, flipping on his light bar. He did not even have time to accelerate before the wall of sound hit him. He slammed on his brakes, throwing the cruiser into park across the right lane. Coming over the crest of the hill was a tidal wave of chrome leather and blinding halogen. 200 iron hounds riding shoulder to shoulder, consuming every lane of the interstate. They did not slow down. They did not swerve. Dawson realized with cold, absolute certainty that if he did not move, they would simply ride over him, crushing his cruiser into a metal coffin. He threw the car in reverse, aggressively backing onto the dirt shoulder. Just as the Vanguard blew past, the sheer wind displacement rocked his heavy police cruiser on its suspension like a toy. He locked eyes with Silas Gallagher for a fraction of a second as the massive biker roared past. There was no defiance in those dark eyes, only a terrifying, desperate urgency. Dawson looked past the motorcycles and saw the tow truck in the center, flanked tightly by bikers. He saw the Iron Hound's colors. He understood. He flipped his sirens to maximum volume, pulled a hard U-turn, and floored the accelerator. He raced ahead of the convoy, blocking intersections, clearing the path, not because he was afraid, not because he was corrupt, because some debts of honor transcended the badge, and a man who had worn a uniform for 22 years could recognize a life-or-death escort when he saw one. Far behind the convoy, removed from the screaming engines and the flashing lights, a lone matte black sedan turned off the highway onto a deeply rutted dirt road. Clayton drove in silence, the headlights cutting through the dense, unforgiving brush of the deep desert. Pike sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his thighs, his face expressionless. In the trunk, muffled sounds of panic filtered through the steel. Useless kicking, desperate, wordless pleas. Clayton parked the car near the edge of a steep, dry ravine. The moon provided the only light. He turned off the engine. The silence of the desert was absolute and suffocating. Not even the wind moved. "You want the scrapyard boss or the twitchy one?" Clayton asked quietly, popping the trunk release lever. "I will take Vincent." Pike rumbled, stepping out into the cool night air. "He owes the president a blood debt. I am just the collector." The trunk opened. The desert swallowed the rest. The lights of Oak Haven General Hospital appeared on the horizon like a cluster of pale stars. The convoy did not slow down. 200 motorcycles poured over the curbs, jumped the landscape medians, and spread across the parking lot and ambulance bays like a dark mechanical flood. Car alarms triggered in chain reactions across the adjacent streets. Windows vibrated in their frames 3 blocks away. A security guard standing near the emergency room entrance took one look at the approaching wall of chrome and leather, set his radio down on the concrete, and walked inside without looking back. The diesel tow truck skidded to a halt directly in front of the sliding glass doors. Before the engine had fully died, Hawk was already on the ground barking orders. Careful with the stretcher. Keep it level. Do not jostle the packing, or we lose the clot, and he bleeds out in 30 seconds. 4 men lifted Ethan's canvas stretcher from the truck bed with the synchronized precision of pallbearers. His body was barely visible beneath the layers of blood-soaked rags, the IV line, and the portable monitor, emitting its thin, desperate alarm. His face was the color of wet chalk. The oxygen mask that Hawk had strapped over his mouth and nose fogged weakly with each shallow, irregular breath, and the intervals between each fog were growing longer. Mara jumped from the truck bed. Her bare feet hit the home asphalt, and she stumbled, her legs nearly giving out after hours of kneeling on concrete. A biker she did not recognize caught her elbow and steadied her without a word. She nodded at him and ran toward the emergency room doors. Inside, the fluorescent lights of Oakhaven General cast their sterile glow over an empty waiting area. The night shift had been quiet. A tired trauma surgeon named Dr. Harrison Whitfield was reviewing charts at the nurse's station, nursing his third energy drink. Beside him, head nurse Brenda Carmichael was updating patient logs on a computer that was at least a decade past its recommended retirement date. The first thing they noticed was the vibration. The pens in their cups began to rattle. The glass doors of the ER trembled in their frames. The surface of Whitfield's energy drink rippled in concentric circles. "Earthquake?" Brenda asked, gripping the counter. "No, doctor," Whitfield said slowly, looking toward the massive front windows. Through the glass, he watched a sea of motorcycles pour into the parking lot. Headlights swept across the ceiling of the waiting room in long swinging arcs. Before Whitfield could reach the emergency lockdown button, the sliding glass doors were forced open from outside. Silas Gallagher strode into the emergency room. He was covered in desert dust. His leather vest was stained with dark, irregular patches of blood that was not his own. He was flanked by 10 of his largest enforcers who spread out across the waiting room with the practiced efficiency of men securing a perimeter. "I need a trauma team," Silas bellowed, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. "Right now." Dr. Whitfield stepped forward. His heart was hammering, but 22 years of trauma surgery had built a particular kind of courage in him. The courage of a man who has held dying hearts in his hands and negotiated with death on a nightly basis. "Sir, you cannot bring an entire club into my emergency room." Silas closed the distance in 3 strides. He stopped less than 2 feet from the doctor, towering over him by nearly a full head. He did not touch him. He did not threaten him. He simply looked down at the smaller man with an expression that made the fluorescent lights seem to dim. "Listen to me carefully," Silas said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Whitfield's chest. "I have a 17-year-old boy outside those doors with a deep knife wound to the abdomen. An artery is nicked. My medic has it packed, but the boy needs surgical intervention immediately. He has lost close to 40% of his blood volume. His heart has already gone into arrhythmia twice in the last 20 minutes. Silas paused. When he spoke again, each word was measured and deliberate, placed like stones in a wall. "If he dies in your hospital, I am going to hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other?" Behind Silas, the bikers carrying Ethan's stretcher burst through the doors. Hawk was running alongside, one hand maintaining pressure on the wound, the other holding the IV bag above his head. The canvas stretcher was soaked through with blood that dripped onto the clean linoleum in a steady metronomic pattern. Dr. Whitfield took one look at Ethan's ashen face and the massive volume of blood saturating the makeshift stretcher. The politics of outlaw motorcycle clubs evaporated from his mind. He was a surgeon. There was a dying boy. Everything else was noise. "Trauma one move!" Whitfield shouted, his voice snapping into the sharp, commanding cadence of emergency medicine. "Brenda Page, anesthesiology. Get me 2 units of O negative on a rapid infuser. Prep a full surgical tray. I need a vascular kit standing by. Let us go, people." Hawk sprinted alongside the gurney as the hospital staff transferred Ethan from the blood-soaked canvas, rattling off heart rates, blood pressure readings, the exact type and placement of his hemostatic packing, the estimated volume of blood loss. He spoke in the clipped, precise language of battlefield medicine, and the emergency room nurses listened with wide eyes. The swinging doors of the surgical wing closed behind them. The waiting room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Silas Gallagher stood in the center of the room, his massive chest heaving. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the ride was beginning to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that he would not allow to show on his face. He turned slowly, surveying the room. His men had positioned themselves at every entrance, every window, every hallway junction. Nobody was getting in or out of this emergency room without his knowledge and his permission. Mara came through the doors, seconds later, escorted by 2 bikers who had been assigned to shadow her. She crossed the waiting room and threw her arms around her father's waist, pressing her face against his chest. She was still wearing the blood-stained Iron Hound's vest, Roy's vest. In the harsh hospital light, the snarling wolf emblem was partially obscured by a dark rust-colored stain that had once been bright red. Silas put his hand on the back of her head and held her there. He said nothing. For a long moment, the most feared man in 3 states simply stood in a hospital waiting room, holding his daughter breathing. Then he looked across the room at a tall, lean biker with a distinctive silver streak running through his dark hair. Deacon Holland, his vice president, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by his unwavering loyalty to the club and its president. "Deacon." "Yeah, boss." Deacon stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound on the linoleum. "The boy's name is Ethan Cole." Silas said, his voice raw. "He told my daughter that his mother is sick. Lorraine Cole. She lives somewhere in Oak Haven. Take 4 men. Find her. Bring her here safely. She needs to be with her son." Deacon nodded once, a single precise dip of his chin. He turned on his heel and barked orders at a squad of men near the doors. Within 60 seconds, 5 motorcycles roared out of the parking lot and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. "And Deacon," Silas called after him. The vice president paused at the door. "Be gentle with her. She's a sick woman. She does not know what her son did tonight. When you tell her, you make sure she understands that he is a hero. You make sure she is not afraid." Deacon held his president's gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, an understanding forged over decades of shared road and shared blood. Then Deacon walked out into the night. The siege of Oak Haven General had officially begun. For the next 4 hours, the hospital operated under a completely different set of rules. Local police cruisers drove past the entrance, saw the mass of heavily armed bikers surrounding the perimeter, and wisely decided to continue driving. A deputy who attempted to approach the emergency room doors was met by Clayton, who had returned from the desert and now simply folded his massive arms across his chest and stared at the officer until the man returned to his cruiser and radioed dispatch that the situation was, in his professional opinion, not worth the paperwork. The Iron Hounds did not interfere with other patients. An elderly man arrived by ambulance with chest pains and was admitted without incident. A young woman brought her feverish toddler through the emergency room doors at 5 in the morning and found herself walking through a corridor of enormous leather-clad men who parted silently to let her pass. One of them, a bearded giant with a wolf tattoo covering his entire left forearm, held the door open for her and nodded politely. But nobody entered or left the surgical wing without Silas Gallagher's explicit awareness. Inside the operating theatre, Dr. Whitfield fought a brutal, bloody war against the damage that Vincent Cross's hunting knife had inflicted. The blade had missed Ethan's left lung by less than a millimeter, a margin so thin that Whitfield would later describe it to his colleagues as miraculous. But the knife had sliced deeply into the inferior vena cava, one of the largest veins in the human body. It was a wound that killed soldiers on battlefields and victims in emergency rooms with depressing regularity. Whitfield worked with the focused, relentless intensity of a man who understood that the lobby of his hospital was currently occupied by 200 men who had made it very clear that failure was not an acceptable outcome. He sutured, he grafted, he irrigated, he checked, rechecked, and checked again. Ethan's heart stopped on the table at 5:47 in the morning. The flat, monotone scream of the cardiac monitor cut through the operating room like a blade. Whitfield shocked him once, twice. The third shock caught, and the monitor started back into a weak, irregular rhythm that gradually steadied into something resembling life. The heart stopped again at 6:22. This time it took 4 shocks and a direct injection of epinephrine before the stubborn organ reluctantly agreed to resume its duties. Whitfield's hands were shaking when the rhythm returned. He paused for 3 seconds, breathing deeply through his mask, then resumed the graft. In the waiting room, Mara sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins. She had refused to change out of her blood-stained clothes. She had refused food, water, and the blanket that the sympathetic nurse had offered. She sat and she waited and she listened to the muffled sounds filtering through the surgical wing doors, trying to decode the rhythms and silences into information about whether Ethan Cole was alive or dead. Silas sat beside her, not speaking, not moving, just present. His massive body occupied the small plastic chair with an incongruity that might have been comic under different circumstances. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, fingers spread. They were perfectly still, the hands of a man who had learned long ago that there were battles he could not fight, enemies he could not intimidate, and outcomes he could not control. The operating room was one of those places. His power ended at those swinging doors. At 7:15, Mara broke the silence. "Uncle Roy is dead, is he not?" It was not a question, it was a statement. The flat, exhausted recognition of a truth she had known since the moment she ran from the Tahoe and heard those final gunshots fade into the desert behind her. Silas did not flinch. He turned his head slightly and looked at his daughter. In the harsh, fluorescent light, her face looked older than 16. The innocence had been scraped away during the night, layer by layer, like paint stripped from old wood, revealing the harder grain beneath. "Yes," Silas said quietly. "The boys found his truck on Route 14. Roy fought hard, baby girl. He bought you the time you needed." Mara closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the dried blood and grime. She did not sob. She did not collapse. She absorbed the information the way desert sand absorbs rain, completely, silently, without a trace on the surface. "And Vincent?" she asked. Her voice was steady. Silas was quiet for a moment. He studied his daughter's face, searching for something. Perhaps he was looking for the girl who used to hide when the club came to the house. The girl who covered her ears during the loud conversations and left the room when the business talk started. He did not find her. "Vincent Cross and his associate have decided to leave the state," Silas said carefully. "Permanently. They will not be bothering anyone again." Mara opened her eyes and looked at her father. She held his gaze for a long-waited moment. She understood exactly what those words meant. She understood what had happened on a dark desert road while she was sitting in this waiting room. She understood the specific final nature of permanently. She nodded once, and she did not look away. Something shifted in Silas Gallagher's expression, a recognition. and acceptance. His daughter had crossed a threshold tonight that could not be uncrossed. She had not just survived the violence. She had integrated it. She had weighed it and measured it and placed it on the scales alongside the image of a 17-year-old boy bleeding on a gas station floor. And she had arrived at her own conclusion without anyone telling her what to think. At 8:15, the Nevada sun was already baking the asphalt of the parking lot. The emergency room smelled of leather, sweat, stale coffee, and the faint antiseptic tank of a hospital fighting to maintain its dignity under occupation. Every biker in the room was awake. Some stood, some leaned against walls, none sat comfortably. They were waiting with the patient disciplined stillness of men accustomed to long rides and longer nights. The heavy double doors of the surgical wing clicked open. Dr. Whitfield walked out. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 4 hours. His blue scrubs were stained. He pulled his surgical cap off his head, running a hand through sweat-matted hair. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding a young life in your hands and refusing to let go. Every single biker in the room stood up simultaneously. The rustle of heavy leather shifting in unison sounded like a sudden warning before a storm. The movement was involuntary, instinctive, a collective response to the arrival of information that would determine what happened next. Silas gently shifted Mara from his shoulder and stood to his full height. He approached the doctor with slow, measured steps. The room held its breath. "Well?" Silas asked. The single syllable carried the weight of a gavel falling. Dr. Whitfield looked up at the massive biker president. He saw the blood on the man's vest, the dust in his beard, the raw, undisguised fear in the dark eyes that the rest of the world only ever saw as threatening. "He flatlined twice," Whitfield said. "He lost nearly 40% of his blood volume. The damage to the inferior vena cava was severe. The blade came within a hair of his lung." Mara made a small wounded sound. Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. "But," Dr. Whitfield continued, and the single word landed in the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. "The hemostatic packing your medic applied in the field saved his life. Without it, he would have been dead long before you reached this hospital. I managed to graft the vein and stop the internal hemorrhaging. He is in a medically induced coma to allow his body to begin healing. The next 48 hours are critical." He paused. He looked around the room at the scarred, exhausted, desperate faces watching him. "But the boy is a fighter. He is going to live." The exhale that swept through the waiting room was collective and enormous. It was the sound of 200 men releasing a breath they had been holding for hours. Some turned away suddenly fascinated by the ceiling tiles or the pattern on the linoleum floor. Others pressed the heels of their palms against their eyes, disguising the gesture as fatigue. One man near the back, a grizzled enforcer, with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a snarling wolf, sat down heavily in a plastic chair, put his face in his hands and stayed there for a long time. Mara buried her face in her father's chest and wept. Not the desperate, terrified sobs of the night. These were different. These were the tears that come after. The ones that arrive when the body finally understands that survival is no longer in question and releases the accumulated tension of hours of sustained, agonizing dread. Silas held her. His massive hand cradled the back of her head, and he closed his eyes, and for a few seconds, he was not Iron Silas, not the president, not the man who commanded armies and decided fates. He was just a father, whose daughter was safe and whose debt to a stranger was so vast that he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay it. He opened his eyes and reached out, wrapping his massive hand around Dr. Whitfield's. The surgeon winced slightly at the grip, but did not pull away. "You just earned this hospital an endowment, Doc," Silas said quietly. "Whatever equipment you need, whatever staff you want to hire, you write it down. The hounds will cover it." Dr. Whitfield stared at him. Then he nodded slowly, understanding that this was not charity. It was tribute. Just as Whitfield turned to walk back through the surgical doors, the emergency room entrance slid open one more time. Deacon Holland walked in. He moved slowly, carefully, with a gentleness that seemed foreign on a man of his size and reputation. He was guiding a woman by the elbow. She was small, frail, wearing a faded nightgown beneath an oversized winter coat that someone had draped over her shoulders despite the august heat. Her hair was thin and gray, and her hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled tissue to her chest. Her eyes were wide, darting from face to face, as she took in the sea of enormous leather-clad strangers who parted before her, like water before a ship's bow. Lorraine Cole looked like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. Silas saw her immediately. He released Mara and walked toward the entrance. His men stepped aside without being told, creating a wide, clear path. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, softer, almost reverent. Silas stopped in front of Lorraine. He looked down at the frail woman who had raised a son brave enough to take a knife for a stranger, and something in his expression changed fundamentally. He reached up and unclasped his leather president's cut, pulling it off his shoulders and draping it over a nearby chair. Beneath it, he wore a plain black t-shirt, without the vest, without the patches and the snarling wolf and the president rocker. He looked almost like a normal man. Almost. He took Lorraine's hands in his own, gently, as if he were holding something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. "Mrs. Cole," Silas said, and his voice carried a softness that made several of his men look at each other in quiet astonishment. "My name is Silas. Your son saved my daughter's life tonight. He is the bravest young man I have ever met, and as long as I have breath in my lungs, your family will never want for anything again." Lorraine stared up at the giant. Her lower lip trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She simply squeezed his hands and nodded, and the gesture contained more eloquence than any speech could have achieved. Mara stepped forward. She stood beside her father and looked at the woman whose son had bled for her. She wanted to say something meaningful, something worthy of the sacrifice. But the words would not come because no words exist in any language that adequately express the debt of one life saved by another's blood. So Mara simply took Lorraine's arm and walked her through the surgical doors. Two women, a mother and a daughter, bound together by a boy who had decided at 2:14 in the morning that some things mattered more than survival. 48 hours passed. They passed slowly in the way that hospital hours always do, measured. Not in minutes, but in the rhythmic beeping of monitors, in the changing of IV bags, in the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum, and in the quiet, watchful patience of men in leather, who rotated through the lobby in shifts of 40, keeping vigil over a boy most of them had never met. Lorraine did not leave her son's side. The hospital staff had tried gently to convince her to rest in one of the empty rooms down the hall. She had declined with the polite, immovable stubbornness of a woman who had spent years refusing to let illness take her dignity and was not about to let exhaustion take her post. They had compromised on the recliner. It was new plush with adjustable cushions. It had appeared in Ethan's room within an hour of Lorraine's arrival, delivered by two bikers who had carried it up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was too small. Nobody asked where they had acquired it. Nobody wanted to know. Mara came and went. She showered in the hospital staff locker room, borrowed clean clothes from a nurse who was roughly her size, and ate mechanically from the cafeteria trays that the bikers kept bringing to the waiting room. She slept in 2-hour intervals on a bench in the hallway outside Ethan's room, waking each time to the sound of the monitors or the footsteps of the nurses, checking instinctively that the rhythm was still there, that the line on the screen was still moving. Silas handled the aftermath. There were calls to make, arrangements to finalize. Roy's body had been recovered from Route 14 and was being prepared for burial with full club honors. The scrapyard on the county line had been quietly absorbed into Ironhound's territory. Bull, the only surviving member of Vincent's crew, had been found, sitting alone in the scrapyard office with his broken arm staring at the wall. He had offered no resistance when the hounds came for him. He had simply asked very quietly if the kid at the gas station had made it. When they told him yes, he had nodded once and stood up. What happened to Bull after that was between Bull and the man who escorted him out. But unlike his former employer, Bull was not taken to the desert. The hounds recognized the moment in the scrapyard when the big man had chosen not to return to the gas station. That choice, small as it was, had earned him a different kind of mercy, the kind that came with a bus ticket to a distant state and the understanding that if he was ever seen in Nevada again, the mercy would be permanently revoked. On the second morning, at 6:17, Ethan Cole opened his eyes. Consciousness returned in fragments like a jigsaw puzzle being assembled by unsteady hands. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the sharp smell of iodine, the deep agonizing pull in his abdomen with every shallow breath, the scratchiness of hospital sheets against his skin, the distant sound of voices in a hallway speaking in low, careful tones. He pried his heavy eyelids open. The fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit made him wince. His vision was blurry, and it took several long disorienting seconds for the world to resolve into shapes and colors. The first thing he saw was his mother. Lorraine Cole was asleep in the recliner pulled close to the bed. Her hand rested on the edge of his mattress, her fingers inches from his own. But something was different about her, something that Ethan's foggy brain struggled to identify. Then it clicked. The deep, dark circles that usually shadowed her eyes were gone. Her breathing, which was normally ragged and labored from her failing heart, was smooth and steady. Her color was better. She looked rested in a way that Ethan had not seen in months, maybe years. He tried to speak. His throat felt like it was lined with ground glass. He managed a dry, rasping cough that sent a bolt of fire through his abdomen and made him gasp. Lorraine's eyes snapped open instantly. For a moment she just stared at him, her hands trembling, her mouth slightly open. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently against his shoulder, mindful of the maze of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines. "You are awake," she whispered. The words were soaked in tears. "Oh, Ethan, you terrified me. You absolutely terrified me." "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, a scrape of air across dry vocal cords. "Are you okay? Your heart, your chest." Lorraine pulled back and smiled at him. It was a genuine, radiant expression that hit Ethan harder than the knife had. He had not seen his mother smile like that in years. Not since before the diagnosis. Not since before the bills and the medications and the slow grinding erosion of hope that comes with watching your body betray you one system at a time. "I'm fine, baby," she said, squeezing his hand. "Better than fine. You just rest. Everything is taken care of." Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the heavy wooden door of the ICU room opened with a soft click. Silas Gallagher stepped into the room. He wore a clean black t-shirt and dark jeans. His leather president's cut was deliberately absent, left outside the room out of respect for Lorraine. Ethan would later learn that Silas had removed it every single time he visited during the 48 hours of the coma. Despite the casual clothing, the man still filled the space with a gravitational authority that made the air feel thicker, the walls closer, the monitors quieter. Mara followed closely behind him. She was carrying a small white bakery box. She had showered and changed, and without the blood and grease and terror covering her face, she looked like a completely different person. Younger, softer, but her eyes carried something new. A depth and a steadiness that had not been there before the night at the Sinclair station. Ethan's heart rate monitor spiked. The memories came flooding back in a chaotic rush. The fluorescent lights, the bell above the door, the girl stumbling in from the darkness, the knife, the cold, the sound of the world shaking itself apart. Silas noticed the spike on the monitor. He stopped at the foot of the bed and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture that looked almost comical on a man of his size and reputation. "Easy, son," Silas said, his deep voice calibrated to a remarkable softness. You are safe. Nobody in this building is going to hurt you. In fact, there are currently 40 of my men rotating shifts in the lobby and the parking lot. You are the most heavily guarded patient in the state of Nevada. Ethan looked at the giant biker, then at Mara. She offered a hesitant, tearful smile and stepped forward, placing the white bakery box on his bedside table. You told me your mom makes snickerdoodles. Mara said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she could not quite control. I know hospital food is terrible, so I found a bakery in town. They are not your mom's recipe, but I promised we would share a dozen, and I keep my promises. Ethan looked at the box, then at Mara, then at the box again. A weak, genuine smile crossed his face, the first real expression that had appeared there since the knife. Thank you, he said. Silas moved to the side of the bed opposite Lorraine. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the boy with an expression that combined respect, gratitude, and something harder to name. Something that looked like recognition, as if he was seeing in Ethan a quality that he valued above all others, a quality that his world tested for constantly and found rarely. Dr. Whitfield says you have a long road ahead, Silas began. You took a wound that would have killed men twice your age and 3 times your size. I have been in this world a long time, Ethan. I have known a lot of men who talk about courage. You are one of the very few I have met who actually has it. He reached into his back pocket and withdrew a heavy sealed manila envelope. He placed it on Ethan's lap with the careful deliberation of a man presenting something sacred. What is this? Ethan asked, wincing as he shifted his weight. That is the deed to your house, Silas said. Paid in full. No more mortgage. There are also documents establishing a trust in your name. It will cover your college tuition wherever you choose to go. Full ride. Books, housing, everything. And there is a monthly stipend to cover your family's living expenses so that you never have to work a graveyard shift at a gas station again. Ethan stared at the envelope. He looked at his mother. Lorraine was crying silently, but she was nodding, squeezing his hand. Mr. Gallagher. Ethan started, his voice cracking. I cannot accept this. I just did what anyone should have done. No, Ethan. Silas's voice was firm but not unkind. It carried the absolute certainty of a man who has spent decades evaluating human character under pressure and knows exactly what he has seen. You did not do what anyone would have done. Most men would have pointed Vincent to the back room and saved their own skin. You stood your ground against a killer with a knife while you were armed with a tire iron and a high school education. Do not diminish what you did. Silas paused, his jaw tightened slightly. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that pressed the air flat. Speaking of Vincent Cross and his crew, you do not need to worry about looking over your shoulder. They have decided to leave the state permanently. They will not be bothering anyone, ever again. The words settled into the sterile hospital air like stones sinking into deep water. Ethan looked at Silas. He saw the faint discoloration on the knuckles of the man's right hand, a bruise in the shape of someone's jaw. He understood what permanently meant. He understood it completely. He did not ask for details. The desert keeps its secrets, and some questions are better left in the sand. Furthermore, Silas continued, and his voice softened as he gestured toward Lorraine. I had Deacon make some calls. A cardiovascular specialist was flown in from Los Angeles yesterday morning. Top of his field. He reviewed your mother's charts. She has been placed at the top of the transplant list, and the Iron Hounds are covering every medical expense. The surgeries, the aftercare, the medications, all of it, for as long as it takes. Ethan felt a hot tear slip down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He did not have the strength, and he did not have the pride. He had spent years hauling scrap metal and working midnight shifts and watching his mother fade, carrying the crushing weight of a world that seemed designed to break people like them. And now, because of one terrifying moment in the dark, A moment that had lasted no longer than a heartbeat. That weight had been lifted. He looked at the envelope on his lap, then at his mother's face, radiant and rested, and full of a hope he had not seen in years. Then at Silas Gallagher, the scarred, towering, terrifying man who had ridden through the night with an army at his back to save a stranger's life. "Thank you," Ethan whispered. The words were completely inadequate, and everyone in the room knew it. But they were all he had. Silas reached out and placed his massive hand on Ethan's shoulder. The touch was careful, controlled, completely devoid of the violence the hand was capable of. "You are not a stranger anymore, Ethan," Silas said quietly. "You bled for the hounds. You shielded my blood with your own. That makes you family, and family takes care of their own." He held the boy's gaze for a moment longer. Then he straightened up and stepped back, giving the room back to Lorraine, who immediately leaned forward and began fussing with her son's pillows and blankets, with the focused intensity of a mother who has been waiting 48 hours for something to do. Mara opened the bakery box. The warm, sweet smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the sterile hospital room, pushing back the iodine and the disinfectant and the clinical coldness. She placed a snickerdoodle on a napkin and set it on Ethan's bedside table. "They are still warm," she said. "The bakery just made them this morning." She took one for herself and bit into it. She chewed slowly, watching Ethan's face. He reached for the cookie with trembling fingers, wincing at the pull in his abdomen, and took a small, careful bite. The cinnamon hit his tongue and he closed his eyes. "Not as good as my mom's," he said. Lorraine laughed. It was a small, watery sound, but it was real. "Nothing is as good as mine," she said, and the familiar, gentle arrogance in her voice made Ethan smile. "When you are out of here," Mara said, leaning against the bed rail, "I am going to teach you how to ride a motorcycle. A real one, not some scooter. I do not know if my mom would approve of that," Ethan said, glancing at Lorraine. Lorraine looked at Mara. She looked at the door beyond which she knew 40 men in leather were keeping watch over her son. She looked at the envelope on his lap, heavy with a future she had stopped believing was possible. "We will discuss it when you are healed," Lorraine said diplomatically, which was not a no. Silas caught Mara's eye and tilted his head toward the door. A silent signal. Time to let the boy rest. Mara nodded, understanding, and touched Ethan's hand one more time. "I will come back tomorrow," she said, "and the day after that, and the day after that, until you are sick of snickerdoodles and sick of me." "That might take a while," Ethan said. Mara smiled. A real full smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. Then she turned and followed her father toward the door. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed their institutional hymn. The linoleum gleamed. A nurse walked past, nodding respectfully at Silas, who nodded back. Through the windows at the end of the corridor, the Nevada sun blazed down on the parking lot, where the remaining iron hounds maintained their quiet, watchful vigil. Mara stopped walking. Silas continued a few more steps before he realized she was no longer beside him. He turned back. Mara was standing in the middle of the hallway looking at him. Her arms were at her sides. Her chin was raised. The morning light from the window caught her face, illuminating the bruise on her cheekbone and the raw scrapes on her palms and the new, unyielding steadiness in her eyes. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, baby girl. Tell me about the club, about what you do, all of it. Not the version you tell me to keep me safe. The real version." Silas Gallagher studied his daughter for a long time. The hallway was quiet except for the distant beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum. He saw the girl she had been, the child who covered her ears, the teenager who went to boarding school to escape his shadow. And he saw the young woman standing before him now, the one who had held a dying boy's life between her bloody hands for 2 hours in the dark, the one who had climbed into a pit and trusted a stranger's courage. The one who had looked him in the eye when he told her about Vincent Cross and had not flinched. She was not running anymore. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder. Not the heavy, commanding grip of a club president. The careful, aching touch of a father who understood that the thing he had tried hardest to protect his daughter from was the very thing she had chosen to face. "Okay," Silas said quietly. "Okay." He gestured to a bench along the wall. They sat down together. Silas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. Mara sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched, and he began to talk. Outside, the August sun climbed higher over Oakhaven. The heat shimmered off the asphalt in liquid waves. The Iron Hounds' motorcycles gleamed in the morning light, standing in ordered rows, waiting patiently for their riders. In his hospital bed, Ethan Cole slept. His mother held his hand. His heart monitor beeped its steady, faithful rhythm. On his bedside table, a half-eaten snickerdoodle sat on a napkin, filling the room with the scent of cinnamon and the quiet, stubborn promise that the world, even at its darkest, still had the capacity to smell like home. Somewhere in the deep Nevada desert, the sand had already begun to cover certain tracks, certain tire marks, certain evidence of decisions made in the dark hours before dawn. The desert is patient. It keeps its secrets. It does not judge. It simply accepts what is given to it and holds it in its vast silent depths until the memory of it fades from living minds and becomes just another layer in the ancient indifferent stone. And in a hospital hallway bathed in morning light, a girl who had spent her life running from her father's world finally stopped running. Not because she had no choice, not because she was trapped, but because she had walked through the fire and discovered that the heat did not destroy her. It forged her. It burned away the uncertainty and the fear and the carefully maintained distance. And what remained was something harder and clearer and truer than anything she had been before. Mara Gallagher leaned against her father's shoulder and listened. And the man who had built an empire on iron and blood, and the loyalty of 200 men, spoke to his daughter in the softest voice he possessed, telling her the truth she had earned, preparing her for the road she had chosen. Not because he wanted this life for her, but because she had proven in a single terrible night that the life was already in her. It had always been in her. She had simply needed the fire to find it. Dawn had broken over Oakhaven, not with the gentle hum of morning birds, but with the fading echo of 200 engines and the lingering scent of burned rubber baked into cracked asphalt. The town would talk about this night for years. The gas station, the blood, the army of wolves that had torn through the darkness to save a boy who earned minimum wage and owned nothing but courage. Ethan Cole survived, his life irrevocably tied to a brotherhood he never asked to join, but had earned in the only currency they recognized. Mara Gallagher stopped running. She found her place not by escaping her father's world, but by walking back into it with open eyes and blooded hands, and the unshakable knowledge that the leather-clad giants who had torn the town apart to save her were more than a gang. They were her family's absolute shield, and she was ready to stand behind it. The men who caused the bloodshed were never seen again, swallowed forever by the unforgiving Nevada desert, where the coyotes ask no questions, and the sand keeps no records, and the sun bleaches everything in time to the same blank, anonymous white. Roy Gallagher was buried 3 days later, with full Iron Hounds honors. 200 motorcycles escorted the hearse through the streets of Oakhaven in a procession that stopped traffic for an hour. Mara stood at the graveside in a black dress, holding her father's hand. She did not wear the leather vest. Not yet. But she carried it folded neatly under her arm, and when the last words were spoken and the last engine fell silent, she pressed it against her chest and whispered a promise to the uncle who had given his life so she could keep hers. Sometimes justice does not wear a shiny badge. Sometimes it wears scarred leather and rides on 2 wheels and demands a heavy blood price that civilized society pretends does not exist. but secretly in its darkest and most honest moments, understands completely. Mara Gallagher learned this on a suffocating August night in a dying gas station on Route 9. And Ethan Cole, the boy who held the door, learned that a single act of selfless courage could summon an army from hell and earn him fiercely loyal guardian angels for the rest of his life. The story of the girl who called the wolves and the boy who held the door would be told for years, passed from rider to rider, from clubhouse to clubhouse, from one generation of iron and leather to the next. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a reminder that the world, for all its cruelty and indifference, still produces people willing to bleed for strangers, and that sometimes the strangers bleed back.